It is my true pleasure to introduce to you Juliane Reinecke, Professor of Management Studies, Academic Area Head Topos Research, and Faculty Director for Sustainability at the Said Business School, Oxford University. Thank you all for joining us for this very special occasion. It is customary that Oxford University statutory professors share their research with a broad audience. And we are pleased to welcome distinguished guests and colleagues from across the university and beyond to this event. Professor Reinecke joined the Said Business School in September 2022. She brings with her a long list of remarkable academic achievements, professorships at the University of Warwick and King's College London, and serving as Associate Editor at Academy of Management Journal since 2022. Among her many other contributions. Professor Reinecke's research employs organization theory, political philosophy, and process studies to examine how transnational governance institutions develop through stakeholder interactions to support just and sustainable globalizations in supply chain and other organizations. Her work has been acclaimed by many professional academic bodies, including the Journal of Management Studies Best Paper Award, the Best International Paper Award, and Best Environmental and Social Practices Paper Award at the Academy of Management. And then, I'm personally thrilled to stand here today and introduce Professor Juliane Reinecke to you. I cannot tell you how excited I am, in fact. 2 years ago, on an early, quiet Sunday morning here in Oxford, when I just arrived, the very first person to welcome me to Oxford, to this very city, was actually you. This professor, in true Oxford fashion, on a bicycle, of course, greeted me so warmly that I wasn't sure if it was a coincidence or a part of the official induction process to Oxford University. Thank you for that. Over the past many years, I've been much inspired in my own research by your stellar academic leadership, setting novel agendas for global governance research and critically examining the new role of business in addressing some of the world's most urgent global challenges. I admire your tireless engagement with colleagues from around the world, including support to our young scholars everywhere. And on top of that, I remain sincerely impressed by your engagement also with business practitioners, as you, for example, bring some of your research discoveries into practice and into the corporate boardrooms where global decisions are made, showing the true relevance business schools' research does around the world. In today's lecture, Professor Juliane Reinecke will talk about how intertemporal and collective action dilemmas, from climate change to technological disruption, challenge conventional management thinking. She calls for a shift in scholarship from the firm to the commons and from retrospective analysis to prospective theorizing to design collaborative institutions for stewarding the fragile domain of the future commons. I do not hope, I know that you will enjoy this lecture, and I'm looking very much forward to this as well. And now, please help me invite Juliane to take her place on the floor.
thank you to Dean Mette-Morsing for this kind introduction. Thank you to the PVC Professor Jennifer Payne, to Molly, the Junior Proctor, to the procession, and thank you to all of you for being here. My colleagues, friends, supporters, and especially those who have traveled from afar, from Barcelona, my friend Esther, from Essen, my friend Anne, from Copenhagen, my friend Miriam, and collaborators as well, and also those who are joining us online. Thank you to the SBS events team and my faculty assistant Giovanna, who made this evening possible tonight. It is a great privilege to deliver this inaugural lecture. I've now been at Oxford for 3 years, so perhaps this is less an inauguration than a reflection. They say all good things come in threes. It's my third year at Oxford, it's my third professorship, and my first inaugural lecture. It's been a remarkable 3 years. I've learned so much, and I've had the privilege of working with an extraordinary, intellectually rich, but also just very, very nice community here at SBS and across the university. This lecture, and indeed my scholarship, is not the work of solitary inspiration, but it's the outcome of dialogue and debate and collaboration with colleagues and students and practitioners, reviewers and friends, who have challenged, provoked, and inspired me really along the way. I owe particular thanks to my co-authors and collaborators who have helped shape my thinking over the years, and also very much to my PhD supervisor, Professor Chris Gray, who really, at Cambridge, who gave me the confidence that I needed to start this journey. To my family, my wonderful mother, Anja Hussmann, who cannot be here with us tonight, unfortunately, but she will be joining us online. She's an artist whose creativity really inspires me to pursue new ideas. And also to Paula Versa, my life co-author, who I'm thanking for being my biggest advocate and my most honest critic, for nudging me on in the first place to finally put a date down for this lecture. Oxford, in many ways, is the ideal place for this kind of reflection. It invites us both to look backwards and to look forward, imagining how knowledge might also serve the future. And that's what I want to do this evening, to look back at the ideas and the collaborations that have shaped my work, and also to look forward and ask where it might lead next. So it's a bit of a trailer of what's to come as well. This position that I inaugurate is a professorship of management. It's previously held by Professor Tim Morris. So it's worth thinking about management itself, a ubiquitous term that tends to make us picture the familiar. And what I will, so organizations, strategies, assets, people, so it's kind of the tangible elements of the present. But many of the great challenges of our time, climate change, technological disruption, global inequality, they're not really problems of the present alone. What I will explore in this lecture is their nature as intertemporal and collective action dilemmas. So these are rarely crises of technology. They are more crises of governance and of imagination. Businesses are remarkably good at managing the tangible assets of the present, the firm, the supply chain, the balance sheet, but they lack the institutions to govern the intangible, fragile domain of our collective future. In other words, we know how to manage what we own, but we do not yet know how to manage and to steward what we share. The fragile, contested, and intangible domain of our collective future. And I call this the future commons. The future is not something we can see or measure easily. In fact, it eludes us as we approach it. It's like the horizon. Once we get there, it ceases to be the future. So it is never here. So in this lecture, I want to explore what it might mean to take stewardship of the future commons seriously. And in doing so, to think about management beyond the firm. I will reflect on this question through my own research and to explore how we might design collaborative institutions that sustain action and care across boundaries of single organizations and also across time. I began my academic journey with a Bachelor of Economics in Philosophy, it was a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Economics, which is really a juxtaposition of economic rationality on the one hand and philosophical reflection on the other hand. Economics promised a world of elegant abstraction populated by rational actors, the homo economicus, whose behavior could be modeled with mathematical precision. Philosophy, on the other hand, encouraged the imagining of alternatives. What if things were otherwise? Philosophy does not just ask how the world works, but how it ought to work, how it could work. And then, as an empirical social scientist, I stepped into the wonderful mess, the messy reality that lies between those two worlds. So over the past 2 decades, my research has taken me from the governance of conflict minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the transformation of labor standards in Bangladesh, to the politics of carbon accounting and sustainability standards. And in doing this, I've always been drawn to the coalface, to where ideas meet lived experience, to how people are affected by and try to reshape the systems that govern them, to make markets fairer, safer, and more sustainable. As an ethnographer, that meant being in the fields, in stakeholder meetings on fair trade standards, in the tents, in cold winters, in the occupied protest camp, in the endless traffic jams of Dhaka, on the floors with families of the victims of the Rana Plaza tragedy, quite literally in the mud or the dust, conducting interviews, listening, learning. And in this fieldwork I've followed farmers, activists, buyers, unionists, people that are really driven by passion and purpose, and people who often imperfectly, are not only trying to improve the present for themselves, but who try to imagine and organize this uncertain, contested terrain of the future. And across these seemingly desperate fields runs a common thread, and that is really how do we build institutions capable of stewarding what we hold in common, not only across organizations and societies, but also across time. So, through these studies, I've come to see that safeguarding the future commons requires more than technical solutions. It requires collaborative institutions capable of sustaining commitment across organizational, societal, and temporary boundaries. And this journey also encouraged me to reflect on the very foundations of management scholarship and consider the possibility of moving from a retrospective to a more prospective mode of how we do scholarship. In this evening, then, I want to take you on this journey and through 3 shifts that are reflected in the agenda today. So I want to move in part 1 from the firm to the commons, the future commons. In part 2, I want to move from competition to collaboration. In part 3, I want to move from managing the present to managing across time. And in part 3, I want to move from a retrospective analysis to prospective imagination. My hope really is to provoke us as scholars, as citizens, as practitioners, to ask how we might use the tools of management scholarship, not only to optimize what is, but to steward what could be. So let me now fully turn to the theme of my lecture tonight, stewardship for the future commons. The idea of the future as a commons invites us to think of the future not as a private possession, nor as a distant abstraction, but as a shared domain of possibilities, something we co-inhabit, co-shape, and crucially, we can also deplete. To steward the future is therefore to confront 2 deeply interrelated challenges, imagining beyond the boundaries of the organization and beyond short horizons of the present, which my Oxford colleague Tom Hale would call long problems. What you see here is a ski slope dusted with artificial snow on a snowless mountain. It's beautiful and tragic. In the Alps, mountains are snow-covered by artificial means, close to 100% in the Italian Dolomites, the region we study in our project Hot Snow with Paolo Aversa and Alberta Nucciarelli. Ski resorts use fleets of snow cannons to maintain winter itself and sustain this climate-exposed industry. And snowmaking today is no longer just mechanical. It's becoming very sophisticated, AI-driven, using algorithms to optimize temperature, humidity, and energy use. You can control snow of an entire ski resort just from your iPad alone. So here you see one of such stations of controlling the snowmaking. Yet, while our technologies are growing ever more sophisticated, there's also a paradox, right? Because the very conditions that we're trying to optimize here are also literally melting away. Here, the snow. Winter sports is an example of an expiring industry with a highly precarious future. So here one of our respondents said, we are mortgaging our future to prolong a dying model. Real innovation would mean developing sustainable alternatives, not just bigger ski areas. So wrapped glaciers and algorithmic snow do not simply fight climate change, but I think they really reveal a deeper condition, that the future itself has become a terrain of intervention. It's no longer an abstract horizon we move toward. It's something we now work on, invest in, and dispute in the present. And this brings me to the idea of the future commons. Like the atmosphere or the climate, the future is shared but vulnerable, owned by no one, yet affected by all. To speak of stewardship for the future then is to ask, how do we govern and care for something that does not yet exist, but is already being shaped right here and right now? And to illustrate this idea a bit more, I want to talk about the structure of intertemporal dilemmas that arise when actions today have consequences that unfold across time. So this is also the essence of climate change, biodiversity loss, and even the erosion of trust in institutions. So here you see a graph with two technologies, A and B. So technology A is a modest incremental improvement. It requires a relatively small upfront investment and delivers reliable short-term yet returns that peter off. Technology B is a more radical breakthrough innovation, but it needs a large upfront investment, but it could be transformative in the long run. Which one would we choose? A or B? And more importantly, why? There are several compounding reasons why most actors might end up choosing A over B. Why we repeatedly underinvest in the long term. On our research on hot snow, we find that actors get entangled in what we call the climate innovation conundrum, investing in snowmaking innovations that adapt an expiring business model in the short to medium term to changing climate conditions, but do so at the expense of more radical transformative change, while at the same time further contributing to the very underlying problem. So I suggest that the longer our time horizons are, the more able we are to see the benefits of technology B and to act upon them. But our institutional time horizons, they're shortening. So if you think about CEO tenure, it's now 5 to 7 years. The average lifespan of an S&P 500 company has shrunken to 15 years. So our systems of management and governance are overwhelmingly oriented towards the present, towards quarterly results, electoral cycles, and short-term returns. So short-termism is not simply cognitive, it's institutional. It's baked into the infrastructure of markets and of governance. That brings me to the second reason. We built in a tendency to undervalue the future through tools like discounted cash flows and present value. And that logic makes sense for private investments. But when applied to the planet, it just becomes irrational. The third reason is that unlike the past, which we can study, or the present, which we can measure, the future is inherently uncertain. It's a result, and the result of these compounding reasons is what the economist Joseph Schumpeter warned us about in 1942. He said that any system that at every given point in time fully utilizes its possibilities to the best advantage may yet in the long run be inferior to a system that does so at no given point in time. In other words, a world that is focused on short-term efficiency may be sabotaging its capacity for long-term survival. This is the tragedy of the future. This challenge of intertemporality also underpins the very definition of sustainable development, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it's already there in the way we think and define sustainability. Now, thinking about the future and the future commons is also very reminiscent of the tragedy of the commons, where the rational behavior of each leads to collectively a rational outcome, a shared pasture that is destroyed. Hardin therefore concluded that freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. But tragedies are not inevitable. In 2009, Elinor Ostrom was awarded, the late Elinor Ostrom, was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Economics, the first woman to ever receive it. And she really brought the topic of economic governance from the fringe to the forefront of scientific attention, as I quote her co-winner Oliver Williamson, by showing how common resources, forests, fisheries, or oil fields or grazing lands can be managed successfully by the people who use them rather than by governments or private companies. So she overturned Hardin's pessimism. Yet, if we think about the global commons, ecosystems in the global commons, that becomes more difficult. Think of the planetary boundaries. That's been first theorized by a group of scientists around Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Center, which shows that the life support systems that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth are actually being crossed by our human activity. So these life support systems, they belong to no one, yet sustain everyone. And the World Economic Forum estimates that over 50% of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. Yet no single actor, no company, government, or community has the authority to govern them. So I propose that we can extend this logic to the future. So we can think about the future itself as a commons. And this really means also shifting how we think about the future. And this draws on work that I've done with my dear friend and collaborator, Maiken Schulz at Copenhagen Business School, where we thought about what does it really mean to think about the future commons. It means shifting how we see the future, not as an unlimited resource, not an unlimited horizon that we can exploit freely, but as an intangible, shared, and scarce resource, one that can be depleted or preserved. And like any commons, it is prone to overuse, what we might call the tragedy of the future commons. So degradation of the future commons happens when benefits accrue to the present, while harms are dispersed across future generations. But to imagine the future as a commons is to recognize both possibilities, that it can be degraded or protected, and that our shared capacity to flourish depends on collective long-term stewardship. So how can we manage what does not yet exist, the fragile contested domain of the future commons? So as its core, it means to embrace stewardship as a governing principle, the responsibility to care for what we do not own and for those who are not there yet. So as a definition, stewardship is the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, especially the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. Extending this to the future commons, we can define it as the collective responsibility to safeguard the shared conditions of future life. And this requires stewarding in space as well as across time. And I will explore what both might mean throughout this lecture. To do so, stewardship also really must ask to govern as if the future were in the room, to give voice to generations and ecosystems that cannot speak for themselves. To govern the future commons, institutions must develop the capacity to represent the absent, to make long-term well-being legible and actionable in today's decisions. And that brings me to the next question: what kind of collective arrangements, what forms of governments can make such stewardship possible? So I want to come to the second part and the second shift from competition to collaboration. So if in the first part of this lecture I explored the future as a common, some things that we can collectively deplete or sustain, the second part now turns to how actors manage global commons dilemmas and what this means for management. Typically, we think about management as serving the firm, optimizing efficiency, control, and competitiveness within bounded entities. But as the boundaries between firms and societies and ecosystems blurs, management's domains expands and transcends geographies, from climate and to labor rights and global supply chains. So my own research on conflict minerals captures this shift, from the firm to the commons and from competition to collective stewardship. For a long time, companies treated armed conflict in places like the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo as remote, tragic, but not their problem. It seemed far outside the domain of corporate management. So my research traced how a vital shift took place that established that these conflicts were in fact not that distant at all. That global supply chains for conflict minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, used in consumer electronics, our phones included, were materially and morally connected to conflict and gender-based violence in upstream countries like the DRC. A conflict that once seemed distant and intractable suddenly became something urgent and potentially solvable. Companies began to understand that their operations were entangled in a global commons of responsibility, a web of interdependence that required them to take action across distance and in the absence of direct control. What followed was then a shift from individual firm responses to collective governance that helped address, not perfectly, very imperfectly, but trying to take responsibility for their supply chains. But this conflict minerals case is not just about supply chain transparency, it's really how firms were rendered stewards of interconnected global issues, and how new forms of governance beyond the firm can emerge once these interdependencies between corporate sourcing in distant conflicts are actually made visible. A second example comes from my own research on the Bangladesh garment industry after the Rana Plaza disaster. I have followed this for over a decade now, so many of you will know some of my research in this area. I've done this with a colleague, Jimmy Donaghy, at the University of Southern Australia, and more recently with Maureen Khan, who's here at the Oxford Martin Institute, and Esther Henchen, who's also in the audience from the University of Barcelona. More than 1,100 workers lost their lives in an entirely preventable factory collapse. The tragedy exposed really the limits of private regulation, the codes of conduct and audits that had promised responsibility, but without redistribution. And it really illustrates a collective action dilemma. The tendency for firms to underinvest in shared goods, and here, factory safety, because the benefits are dispersed, while the costs are really immediate. So I still have multiple research projects that are going on around democratic governance and voice, negotiating collaborative agreements, comparing institutional trajectories of different governance models, how to localize governance models, and looking at very, very persistent, wicked problems such as excessive overtime. But where there are many outstanding challenges, I want to focus on one governance institutions that I think demonstrates how transformative change for an entire industry is actually possible within a very short time frame of, well, now it's a decade, but it has really improved within 5 years' time. And that is the Bangladesh Accord for Fire and Building Safety. So in response to the Rana Plaza tragedy, new transnational institutions emerged, notably the Accord. And this was a 5-year, legally binding agreement for the very first time in transnational governance, private governance, between brands and trade unions to ensure a safe working environment in the Bangladesh ready-made garment industry. This is an extremely important industry for Bangladesh. Over 80% of the country's exports are generated by garments. So for the first time here, worker representatives actually sat at the table with multinational buyers. And this was really a massive, massive undertaking. Over 200 companies signed up to this collective action institution. There were over, I think, in total, over 2,000 factories that were inspected, over 2 million workers working at these factories that are covered, and tens of thousands of initial inspections or follow-up inspections. And this really takes a lot of work. It's very in-depth engineering assessments, fire assessments, electrical assessments. It's really in-depth work, and just getting to these factories takes a really long time, and it's really kind of a really big undertaking. So within 5 years, it led to remediation rates of about 90% in an industry where there were deadly accidents on almost a daily basis. So of course, it did not improve all the conditions in supply chains, but on the condition of factory safety, in the factories that are covered, it has massively improved factory safety so that workers at least do not have to be injured or even die going to work. So this was a radical shift as well in governance. So here we see how a collective infrastructure for accountability was created that transcended individual firms. And in our research, we found that stewardship, this collective stewardship in practice, really means building these collective institutions that make taking responsibility possible. And we identified some of their core characteristics. So one was that collective action provided the leverage that was needed, where individual actors alone don't have the necessary leverage. Second is the pooling of resources. Once major brands and unions joined forces, compliance costs no longer looked like a competitive disadvantage, and also enhanced the quality of governance. Now, really in-depth systems could be built, skilled engineers could be hired, and do this really, really in-depth work. It made economic, reputational, and even operational sense to collaborate. And that then also meant that brands started to see the positive changes that no one would have achieved on their own. Accountability was ensured through collective oversight, and so that free riders were punished and were incentivized to contribute to the collective effort. And also multi-stakeholder collaboration with unions secured legitimacy and worker voice as well. And so this is what we can call the collective dividend of cooperation. When institutions align incentives and distribute responsibility, they make commons governance not only an ethical imperative, but actually an economic advantage. Then stewardship ceases to be a burden and actually becomes a collective achievement. And in our case, it actually created a spiral of escalating commitment in a positive sense, where despite all the political challenges that signatories had to face, they kept renewing their commitment to the institution, extending the agreement, even though they had many opportunities to just opt out. And that is perhaps the deeper insight across these studies, that collective action solves the collective action problem not by eliminating self-interest, but by redefining it. What began as moral outrage transformed into institutional rationality. When everyone acts together, the impossible becomes not only possible, but it becomes the rational and actually the desirable thing to do. But managing the commons here across geographies, across communities, across supply chains, is one of the parts of the future commons, the commons part. But there's also the temporal part. Stewardship also requires us to extend care not only across geographies, but across time. So I want to move into the third part and move from managing the present to managing across time. So if the previous section resituated management from the firm to the commons and from competition to collaboration, this part now turns to the temporal challenge of stewardship, from managing the present to managing across time, and specifically how the future itself is shaped. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, management, as we understand and study it, is often concerned with optimizing the present rather than stewarding the future. So if the commons evokes the idea of collective governance, the future evokes the idea of temporal or intertemporal governance. So just as the commons are socially constructed through rules and boundaries and practices, so is time. So time is not merely ticking away, it is organized and measured and also made meaningful through institutions, our institutions of time. And let me share an anecdote, because here in Oxford, we have our own gentle rebellion against the tyranny of chronometric synchronization. At Christ Church, I don't know if anyone is a member of Christ Church, I think I see one, the bells of Tom Tower don't chime at 9 o'clock, as you might expect, but at 5 minutes past Greenwich Mean Time. This is because Oxford still keeps its own rhythm, Oxford time, a reminder of a moment when scholars here resisted the imposition of Greenwich Mean Time by the railways in the mid-19th century. So it's a charming eccentricity, even if I think my students sometimes take these 5 extra minutes a bit too seriously sometimes. But it also tells us something profound. Something seemingly objective as clock time is in fact a human convention. Time is not natural, it's a collective agreement about how to synchronize our worlds. And the same is very much true for the future. So much of what we take as economic rationality is not only a reflection of the past, but it's also anticipations of imagined futures. So as the sociologist Jens Beckert argued, actors organize their activities around mental representations of the future, projections that coordinate markets, organizations, and policies long before those futures actually arrive. Yet these futures, they are not confined necessarily to empirical reality. Futures are not discovered, they are constructed through forecasts, strategies, business plans, and scientific projections. So it is actors, people, who make futures in the present, even if the future in itself does not exist, but we make the future in the present. And once constructed, these futures also become institutionalized, shaping what counts as credible and legitimate and rational. So we live within these architectures of anticipation, discount rate models, transition plans, technology roadmaps that tell us which futures are credible and which are implausible. And this suggests making the construction of these imagined futures an important concern for management scholarship. So we may actually ask, how do different actors make futures in the present? And here I again want to turn to some of the research that I have done across the years and look at some joint insight across studies conducted. And I think a core insight really from my research concerns the power of what we maybe can call institutional imagination. So the capacity of actors to envision and fight for new collective arrangements when existing institutions fall short. So here in the face of crisis that maybe seem ungovernable like collapsing factories, melting glaciers, or global inequality, progress rarely begins with policies or formal authority. It often begins with people, and with people who are really passionate, activists, entrepreneurs, social movements, organizational mavericks, who just refuse to accept the limits of what is possible. And I've studied many of them over time and have always been inspired by their courage, by their passion, by their creativity. And they act as if alternative futures were already within reach. And often this comes at professional or personal risk. Social movement activists take a lot of professional risk. Or at least a great deal of discomfort if you think about camping in very cold temperatures. And so I found that change often begins with their acts of institutional imagination, with people and movements who stretch our sense of what is possible, sometimes by force, and often through experimentation. In the fair trade movement or the global Occupy movement, we saw how activist organizations challenge dominant imaginaries of value, challenge, what is a fair price? Is it based on, subjective theories of what everybody's willing to pay, or based on what is actually sustainable for producers who produce goods we consume? So the question what counts as fair, as legitimate, or as valuable in markets. So in our studies on the Occupy movement or collaborations on the Premium Collective, making cola system changes drinkable, or the animal rights movement, quite paradoxically, incubating the cultivated meat industry, we found that these actors construct the future not merely through protest, but through prototyping, testing alternative horizontal forms of governance, alternative business models, and also prefigure more equitable economies and supply chains. So, in other words, they transform protest into practice and turning critique into organizational experimentation. And what unites these actors, activists, entrepreneurs, hybrid organizations alike, is that they dare to reimagine the rules of the game. Through their actions, they kind of shift the boundaries of what we think is possible. So they move from the impossible to the imaginable, from the imaginable to the doable, and eventually to the desirable. And so I think that is why it is worth studying these types of actors, these types of movements that exist often at the margins of markets and institutions, but they're often bringing in, creating profound change in these markets and institutions. Another stream of my research has focused a bit more on institutional actors and looked at how they reconfigure temporal infrastructures. And these institutional actors, from standard setters to pension funds, they challenge and seek to re-engineer these temporal infrastructures through which sustainability is governed. And these are often invisible architectures that organize how we think about, measure, and act upon time. So in my early work on fair trade standards, which I started when I was doing my doctoral work, I found that even well-intentioned governance systems embed very specific assumptions about time and development. And these temporal assumptions, so for instance, how quickly progress should happen or what counts as a timely improvement, they become deeply consequential in shaping what sustainability comes to mean in practice. And more recently, in collaboration with another colleague here who is now at the Skoll Center, Jimmy Jha, we examined net zero transition planning and the greenhouse gas protocol, the global standard for carbon accounting. And we argue that these climate standards, they serve as temporal infrastructures. They integrate these radically different time horizons into a single, seemingly objective number. Carbon, however, stays in the atmosphere for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, while finance works on a quarter-by-quarter basis. And in doing so, these standards, what do? They flatten time. They're compressing kind of this long-term uncertainty of climate trajectories into near-term performance metrics. And our work on such standards also shows how standards, through kind of rethinking the temporal assumptions, might be redesigned to reallocate carbon responsibility across time. So to create accountability not only for the past, but also for the future. In work with Yuval Milo and Susan Cooper, we look at pension funds and climate risk and how pension funds come to think as something which the responsible investment community now calls macro stewardship, of how these institutional actors are taking responsibility to preserve what they think is really integral to the long-term survival of the financial system. So thinking about climate risk and trying to think what it means to actually, as an asset owner, as an asset manager, integrate this into their own governance practices. So more generally, I think we can describe this as temporal governance, which is the collective shaping of how time is imagined, measured, and valued within institutions. By the way, this is the Gradle quadrangle of a new college, which is a passive house building that served as Jimmy's main case study for his PhD, and that we used to kind of, we thought collectively about how these temporal assumptions work if we try to imagine the intertemporal dilemmas that decision makers face if they want to construct passive houses or not, an ultra low emissions standard. So temporal governance, that really determines who defines the relevant time frames. What's our time horizon? Should it be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years when we make these decisions? Which futures are rendered credible and which are maybe rendered impossible? How responsibility is allocated across time, across future generations? and how we bring these future generations into our system of responsibility and accountability. So my argument so far has been that management needs to evolve to serve the future commons across geographies to manage the commons and across time to manage the future. And this really requires these new forms of governance beyond the boundaries of the firm and beyond short-term horizons of the present. I suggest then that we also need to think of how our own theories of management must also become prospective, oriented towards a possible, not just the past. And so I want to turn to the final part of this lecture and turn the question of stewardship through the future back on ourselves as academics, on management scholarship. And the conundrum that we face within academia in times of disruption is how we think about the future. So the future really poses a very peculiar problem. By definition, it is not present yet. As an empirical social science, management scholarships, myself included, we deal with the social world as it exists and as it came to be. Its methodological tools are based on data that is sourced from observable events that have already occurred. So we are, by design, retrospective empiricists. We are, as a field, devoted to studying what has already happened, explaining what already exists, analyzing data from worlds already fading. Our empiricism is often very meticulous, but it is backward-looking. And this makes sense if the world is stable, and if we can project from past patterns, and we can project forward into the future, when the future is an extension of the past. But as the climate crisis, technological acceleration, and social upheaval remind us, the future is very unlikely to look anything like the past. So the conditions for our theories are actually changing faster than our ability to theorize these worlds. And I think that's really the conundrum, the temporal conundrum of the future for scholarship, for management scholarship in particular, that it requires conceptualizing and theorizing what is not yet observable and what does not yet exist. So I would define myself as a problem-driven scholar, and I have tipped my toe into many different theoretical conversations, too many, maybe at times. But across the projects that I've pursued, I've often found that the complexity of the theories that we have, they often don't match the complexity of the real-world problems that we're actually trying to explain with these types of theories. So our scholarship remains also a bit compartmentalized. It's disciplinary, often very incremental and retrospective. And I'm saying this, as an associate editor at one of management's, biggest journals. So I'm also pointing this at myself as a scholar and as an editor of our scholarship. And I think what is really needed are imaginative theories for what could be, and that is really moving from predicting to co-creating futures. So thinking also about how we as scholars can create impactful theory for stewarding the future commons. And I think this is also compounded by the rise of generative AI. At some point, I had to mention it, as an epistemic actor. AI systems are now vastly superior to humans in processing and analyzing data, right? They can mine an entire archive of human history in milliseconds. In other words, AI will soon outperform us at the very thing that defines much of our discipline, pattern recognition from historical data. So it might be that our analytical capabilities are dwarfed by corporate big data very soon. So these large language models that are trained on big data, they will do what we do faster and cheaper and more comprehensively than any of us, any academic ever could. So what remains for us? I suggest imagination and the capacity to ask what ought to be. Our comparative advantage is not in processing data, but in cultivating ideas. in developing the concepts and narratives that make alternative futures thinkable. And that is very much the spirit of prospective theorizing, an idea that I've worked on with my colleague and co-author Ali Gumichet. The idea that our role is not only to analyze the world, but to prefigure its transformation. So we defined prospective theorizing as a future-oriented approach to theorizing that is concerned with imagining desirable futures. So we think that if our theories are to matter, they must not only interpret the world, but they also must help to reimagine it. So it really invites us to see theorizing as future-making as well. How can we operationalize this? Well, we think that is a collective endeavor, but we believe that it involves two conceptual leaps. And the first leap is from projection to imagination, so towards the right-hand side of this 4x4. It invites us to complement our retrospective analysis with future-forming imagination. So rather than extrapolating from the past and to predict what is likely to happen, we may also imagine what is possible. Because where projection assumes continuity, imagination embraces discontinuity, opening space for novelty and transformation. The second leap is from value neutrality to value consciousness. So instead of pretending detachment, we acknowledge that scholarship always carries normative assumptions. The question is maybe rather, our dependent variable, firm performance, is already a normative judgment on what we deem as valuable to study, right? So what if it could be nature regeneration or, increase in more equitable distribution? A values-led stance makes these explicit and directs inquiry towards desirable futures. So we would end in the bottom right-hand side quadrant. So together, these leaps, they can expand our field from describing what to describing what is, to envisioning what could become. So what might that look like, researching at the frontier of imagined desirable futures? Certainly this shift will call for new methodological tools and new approaches to how we do scholarship, and for cultivating transdisciplinary literacy, learning to think forward and across the epistemic boundaries of our disciplines. Science is also a collective endeavor, so also let me connect with some of the extraordinary work that is happening here at Oxford University and link it with the realm of management scholarship. And so one way to do is to connect through thought experiments, a method that has been long used by physicists and philosophers to really test the limits of the imaginable and to then evaluate whether it is desirable or not. So rather than asking what is, we might instead ask, what if? We could ask, for instance, with Oxford physicist and IPCC author, Professor Miles Allen, what if carbon producers were legally required to take back what they entail? A carbon take-back program. Or we might ask with Kate Rayworth, who's an economist at Oxford's Environmental Change Institute, what if every company operated within the planetary donut, which describes a safe and just operating space bounded by ecological limits and social foundations? And it's an interesting model because it integrates the planetary science with moral philosophy and design thinking. Or we might join my colleague Annette Mikes and her work with the Oxford Ministry for the Future, exploring how dialogue with the humanities can foster imagination. And so for management scholarship, I think these questions really open the door to experiments in business models, or what the sociologist Eric Olin Wright called real utopias, that are ventures that exist on the fault line between dreams and practice. Together with my colleague Mary Johnston-Louis, I've been studying one such experiment that is called Nature on the Board. Companies that create a nature guardian, an independent directorship role, charged with acting in the interest of the more than human world, equal in standing to human directors. Faith in Nature is a UK-based B Corp that was the first to change its constitution and appoint nature as a director on its board. Soon after, another British B Corp, the House of Hackney, followed and also extended representation to future generations as well. So these are really interesting experiments of thinking, how do we make the absent nature and future generations visible and represent them in kind of corporate governance. And so these experiments in corporate governance, they show how stewardship can be institutionalized not as a voluntary aspiration or as a sustainability add-on, but really as a redefinition of purpose and power within the firm. So this is just to give you like some idea, and each of these examples I think really demonstrate the value of working with and between disciplines, grounding ideas in science while extending them through imagination to make alternative institutions thinkable before they exist. So for management scholarship, this would really mean widening our scope and also widening our models. That does not mean importing from other fields, but really collaborating across them, making management a meeting ground for physics and finance, ecology and governance, ethics and accounting. To do this well, it's not just about speculation. Instead, it requires what Ali and I have called speculative rigor, rigorous imagination, disciplined, transparent, generative, and normatively aware. As Andy Abbott suggests in Methods of Discovery, science is a conversation between rigor and imagination. What one proposes, the other evaluates. Speculative rigor, as we define it, combines the analytical discipline of theory with the normative imagination of design and rests on 4 principles. The first, generative potency. So we cannot test the rigor of this theorizing against empirics because it hasn't happened yet, right? So empirical validity, truth, the capacity to represent the world as it is cannot be the criterion. Instead, drawing more on pragmatist philosophy, it's the capacity to open new conceptual and moral possibilities for action. In the context of the planetary crisis and crisis of democracy, the aim of theory cannot simply be truth. It also must be usefulness. So can it guide the construction of institutions and narratives that make better futures thinkable? Process transparency, are the imaginative and normative assumptions clear and contestable? Speculative plausibility, does it cohere with what is scientifically and socially possible? And fourth, plausible desirability. Does it align with the principles of intergenerational justice and the common good? To do this requires a lot of courage and humility. As editors, reviewers, and authors, we are stewards of our own discipline's imagination. We decide what counts as rigorous, what counts as legitimate, and therefore what kinds of futures can be thought. If we cling only to the comfort of the observable, we risk becoming scholars of the past tense. But if we cultivate this prospective imagination with speculative rigor, we can help shape the architecture of the future commons, and not as owners of knowledge, but really as stewards of knowledge. And it is with this aim of pushing forward the imaginative frontier of management scholarship and to cultivate transdisciplinary literacy that we're exploring here the possibility of creating an Oxford 2050 Institute that is a joint initiative of the Business School and the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And it's something that we have worked on over the past couple of years together with Mette Morsing and Marion, Colin Mayer, and Maria Subelda, and many others. And the mission is really to provide a transdisciplinary infrastructure for imagination that helps to shape the future of business and sustainability, to co-create these types of visionary business models, yet science-based models for regenerative economy, new models of leadership, of ownership, and of governance. Because by 2050, the world will really be defined by the decisions that we take today and by the ideas that we foster and that will take hold. So the Oxford 2050 Institute will serve as this laboratory for future institutions, a place where imagination meets scientific rigor and where scholars and entrepreneurs and practitioners, where we can work together to prototype the business of the future. And I hope that it will bring to life the very principles I have argued for tonight. Interdisciplinary literacy, integrating science, business, and the humanities. Collective imagination, designing institutions that act with the future. And speculative rigor, combining creativity with credibility so that our ideas can travel from the periphery to the center. And so I also warmly invite you as colleagues and students and partners, friends, to join us in building this imagination infrastructure and to experiment and to collaborate with us to help steward the future commons together. So let me end where I began with the future commons and stewardship for the future. If the future is a commons, then scholarship too must be part of its stewardship. We are not just interpreters of the world, we are really its co-authors. Theories are performing the world that they're trying to explain. At a time when machines can predict, we must dare to imagine. Stewardship, as we've seen, is about holding in trust what cannot speak for itself, the absent, the unborn, the not yet. This includes, I think, the future of ideas. And in a discipline built on analysis, we must recover the courage to ask not only what is true, but what is worth becoming true. So our task as scholars is to ensure that knowledge too has a future, that we do not simply study the world as is, but help imagine the world it could still become. So the challenge for us, or the task, is not only to theorize the future, but to theorize for stewarding the future. Thank you very much.